August 17, 2025, a date that marks the end of one of Latin America's most remarkable political experiments. For 2 decades, Bolivia defied the continental trend, building a thriving socialist state under indigenous leadership. Today, we're witnessing its spectacular collapse. This is the story of how the Movimento Toward Socialism MAS lost everything, and what it means for South America's future. No country in Latin America does politics quite like Bolivia. The intensity, the drama, the constant upheaval. It's all part of a nation that has endured more coups and political transformations than anywhere else on the continent. But what ended last weekend wasn't just another government change. It was the conclusion of the most successful grassroots political movement in 21st century Latin America. The numbers tell a devastating story. In Bolivia's presidential election, centrist candidate Rodrigo Paz Pereira led with 32% of the vote, followed by right-wing former president Jorge Tuto Quiroga at 26.7%. But here's what's truly shocking. The official MAS candidate Eduardo del Castillo finished 6th with a mere 3.2%. Reuters called it a stunning blow to a party that had dominated Bolivian politics for 20 years. Even more telling, 19.9% of ballots were spoiled, making spoiled votes effectively the third largest bloc. To put this in perspective, spoiled ballots in Bolivia typically range between 2 to 3%. This unprecedented jump was the result of Evo Morales calling for ballot spoiling as a form of protest after being barred from running. These spoiled votes concentrated in rural and indigenous areas, Morales' traditional strongholds, proving he remains the most popular leftist leader, even in political exile. To understand this collapse, we need to go back to Bolivia's remarkable transformation. Until 2019, Bolivia had one of the fastest-growing economy in the entire hemisphere. Real per capita GDP grew by more than 50% over Morales' 13-year presidency, twice the rate of growth for the Latin American and Caribbean region. The foundation of this miracle was the bold nationalization strategy. On May 1, 2006, just 100 days into office, President Morales moved to nationalize Bolivia's oil and gas reserves, ordering the military to occupy gas fields and giving foreign investors a 6-month deadline to comply or leave. This wasn't just symbolic, it was transformational. The financial impact was staggering. Since 2005, revenues to the government from the hydrocarbon sector increased almost 7-fold in nominal result. The state raised its share of revenues from Bolivia's to giant gas fields from 50% to 82%. While taking a 60% share at minor deposits, the new hydrocarbon law maintained royalties at 18%, but increased taxes from 16% to 32%, giving the government control of commercialization. These revenues funded an unprecedented social transformation. The share of industry as a whole to GDP increased from 30% in 2000 to 37.3% in 2010. But the real miracle was in social outcomes. Poverty dropped from 60% to 35% between 2005 to 2019. Extreme poverty plummeted from 38% to 15%, more than having in absolute terms. The middle class expanded to 58% of the population. Infant mortality rates dropped significantly. School enrollment increased across all levels. Public investment in infrastructure reached historic highs. The government invested heavily in physical infrastructure, roads connecting remote communities, rural electrification projects that brought power to indigenous areas for the first time, and comprehensive welfare networks, universal healthcare programs, education subsidies, fuel subsidies for transportation, and pensions for the elderly created a social safety net Bolivia had never experienced. This wasn't just economic policy, it was a complete reimagining of Bolivia's social contract. The 2009 Constitution officially renamed the country the plurinational state of Bolivia, recognizing 36 indigenous languages as official, establishing indigenous justice systems alongside conventional courts, and enshrining environmental rights. For the first time in Bolivia's history, indigenous peoples weren't just participants in the political system, they were leading it. But powerful interests were watching. Despite these successes, Bolivia faced historically violent opposition groups with ties to the U.S., drug cartels, and what can only be described as hardcore neo-fascist traditions. In November 2019, these forces successfully orchestrated a coup d'état, It began with fraud accusations following elections that would have given Morales a first-round victory. An OAS report denouncing supposed fraud enabled the final act. A coalition of military leaders, Santa Cruz provincial elites, Christian fundamentalists, and establishment figures overwhelmed the MAS leadership. Evo Morales and his vice president fled into exile in Mexico. The 2019 coup eerily resembled Bolivia's Garcia Meza coup in 1980, driven by School of the Americas-trained military officers, big rural landlords from eastern provinces, drug lords, and neo-fascist militias. Just like in the 1980s, the dictatorship had thin international legitimacy from the start. But here's where the MAS movement showed its resilience. In October 2020, Bolivians returned to democracy through ballots. With Morales leading from exile, the movement designated Luis Arce, the former economy minister widely associated with Bolivia's successful policies. Arce won spectacularly with 55% of the vote, a democratic comeback that seemed to restore the MAS cycle. However, cracks were already showing. A rift between Arce and Morales set the stage for the internal warfare that would ultimately destroy the movement. What followed was political fratricide. MAS fragmented into factions. The middle-class faction led by Arce and the grassroots, Campesino Indigenous faction led by Evo. These weren't just ideological differences. It became mutual political blocking and sabotage at every level of the state. Evistas and Arcistas clashed in parliament, disrupting Arce's attempts to implement policies. The Arce faction banned Morales from politics through legal and political maneuvers. Meanwhile, Morales positioned himself simultaneously as leader of both the process and the government, blocking other viable options. Class divisions may partially explain this fragmentation, but they become insufficient when mixed with personal motivations and external pressures. Neither Arce nor Morales built proper channels between them, and relations soured beyond repair. While MAS leaders fought each other, Bolivia's economy went into freefall. By late 2024, the country had one of the highest inflation rates in the region, reaching 10% by year-end, the highest level in over a decade. Foreign reserves, once robust, dwindled dramatically. The parallel exchange rate devalued by 20 to 25% from the official rate. Imports fell by 20% in 2024, affecting businesses and employment. Banks restricted foreign currency transactions, forcing importers to seek alternative payment methods. The government refused to devalue the currency or seek IMF assistance, instead relying on borrowing and using gold reserves as collateral. This poisonous combination of depleted reserves, inflation, and parallel currency markets drove the majority into political disenfranchisement, forcing them to focus primarily on their own subsistence. But internal divisions weren't the only factor. External players had clear interests. Bolivia holds the world's largest lithium reserves, critical for the global transition to electric vehicles. Elon Musk's infamous "We cope whoever we want" tweet wasn't just a throwaway comment. An allegedly leaked audio from 2023 featured Deborah Javilla, the current U.S. head of mission in Bolivia, reportedly stating they had been working for a long time to bring real change to Bolivia by strengthening allies, organizations, and collaborators, especially youth, whom they called agents of change. For this scenario to succeed, she allegedly added, Evo and Arce must relinquish power to close this chapter. So who will inherit Bolivia? The October runoff features two very different but equally concerning options for the left. Jorge Tuto Quiroga represents classic establishment, comprador elite, Latin American politics. A former IBM executive and U.S.-trained politician, he's occupied seats at the IMF, World Bank, and other Washington-aligned institutions. He's currently part of the Madrid Club, essentially a second-hand regional. Davos' 4 presidential has-beens, and a U.S.-loyal hemispheric pressure group. Rodrigo Paz Pereira, the surprise frontrunner, comes from a political family, son and nephew of 2 former presidents. Despite his progressive family background, he built his platform on middle-class populism during his tenure as mayor of Tarija. His unexpected breakthrough reflects Bolivians' desire for change, though what kind of change remains unclear. Regardless of who wins, the implications are profound. Landmark socio-political achievements enshrined in Bolivia's constitution will likely undergo what could be a violent rollback process. This includes Bolivia's current foreign policy stance will be reversed. The country has been a fierce critic of Israel, joining South Africa's genocide case at the ICJ and defending Palestinian rights. As a dynamic Global South player through the ALBA alliance and recently as a BRICS partner, all of this will be realigned toward Western structures. Domestically, after 2 decades of indigenous grassroots leadership, Bolivia will be pulled back to its previous setting. Late neoliberal reforms are expected, along with criminalization of everything surrounding Morales, followers in the tropic region in the Andes. Political and legal revanchism appears inevitable. But here's what makes Bolivia unique. Its longer historical trend isn't just upheaval, but efficient and feisty organizing. No other country in the region has gone through so many confrontations ending in overthrows and government replacements. Bolivia lies at the geographical heart of South America, but also its spiritual one. Created by liberator Simon Bolivar in 1826. Bolivia's complex composition represents South America's mosaic. This may signal possible manifestations of highly effective resistance. If political instruments can withstand what's coming and endure another round of hardship and probable brutality, the end of Bolivia's MAS cycle represents more than just another electoral defeat. It's the conclusion of Latin America's most successful experiment in indigenous-led socialism in the 21st century. The movement's collapse came not from external pressure alone, but from internal fragmentation, economic mismanagement, and the corrosive effects of personal ambition. What happens next will reverberate across Latin America. Will Bolivia's traditional patterns of resistance emerge once again? Or will this mark a definitive rightward shift for a country that has long been the continent's laboratory for political experimentation? One thing is certain. Bolivia's story is far from over. As the country that has endured more political upheavals than any other in the region, Bolivia will once again prove that its politics are both intense and extensive. The question isn't whether change will come again. It's what form that change will take. What do you think? Is this the end of left-wing politics in Bolivia? Or just another chapter in the country's cycle of upheaval and resistance? And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching.